The Story Without a Name by Barbey Orville, Chapter 8. This nameless story of a mysterious domestic tragedy, which fell, no one knew whence or how, on two women, who, while hid in the shadow of a cistern, were yet visible to the eye of fate, occurred coincidentally with the formation of another shadow, one that mingled with and darkened the first, the shadow of the crater which suddenly opened beneath the feet of France. When Madame de Fargeul left her hamlet, the French Revolution had begun, but it was not sufficiently advanced to interfere, as it would have later, with the journey she was taken. That journey was long and painful. Lastheny suffered horribly. The roads were not then what they have since become, and the jolting post-chaise tortured her so that every evening a stop was made at an inn, not for a relay, but for the night. A hearse could not go slower, the postillions disdainfully remarked, and in doing so they spoke better than they knew. The carriage they drove contained almost a corpse. At each lurch of the coach, Lastheny was on the point of fainting, and the devil who lurks in the ambuscade as the best and strongest hearts never failed on such occasions to inspire Madame de Fargeul with a sinister hope. If only she would have a... But the woman's piety strangled the hope before it was even fully expressed. She was closer to her daughter there than in the embrasure of the window, yet they spoke as little as before. What had they to talk of? Everything had been said. Absorbed in themselves, neither thought of looking from the window. They had no curiosity in the landscape, in the passers-by, in anything. The long hours went by in the silence worse than reproach. They were pitiless to each other, atrocious both of them in their resentment. For they were embittered now, one at her inability to extract anything from the obstinate and stupid chill of who was her own, and who sat there with her, knee to knee, the other at the injustice and cruelty of her mother. The long journey across France was an agony to them both, to Agatha as well, for Lastheny's sufferings made her suffer too. She had the same idea concerning her darling's disorder. It was not one for human remedies. Exorcism alone could dissolve the spell. She had said as much to Madame de Fargeul, who, in spite of her profound faith, had shrugged her shoulders, a reply which to Agatha, in her piety, was incomprehensible. Once back in Hollande, however, she knew what she would do. Of all worships in Normandy, the most ancient is that of blissful Thomas de Bivelle, confessor to St. Louis the King, and Agatha intended to walk barefoot to the tomb of that holy man, who could easily add Lastheny's recovery to the other miracles he had worked. If then she was not cured, Agatha determined to ask a priest to exercise the spell. For in spite of her absolute devotion to the Baroness de Fargeul and the familiarity with which she addressed her, Agatha was afraid of the imposing woman who closed her mouth with a word, sometimes with a silence, and she did not dare to presume to offer further advice. At last, after many days, Hollande was reached. If anything could have acted on Lastheny's dulled imagination, it would have been the splendor and gaiety of the sunlight which fell upon her as she alighted from the coffin-like coach. Had her soul been left to her, it would have been deliciously inundated by the brilliance of the sky, such as from the mountain cave she had never seen before. But she was too weak to appreciate the charm of that sudden douche of light. The sun that day gave to the leaves in the hedges, which the rain had brushed and the wind had polished, the glitter and sheen of emeralds. Normandy is the Erin of France, but an Erin rich, cultivated, worthy to bear the color of happy and realized hopes, whereas the Erin of Great Britain has only the right to the livery of despair. Unfortunately, all this affected no one but Agatha. Madame de Fargeul had broken the last tie that held her to earth. In leaving the tomb of her husband, in which she too had expected to be placed, her one thought had been to save her daughter's name. To exterior impressions, she was as unconscious as Lastheny. They had both become, in every sense, unnatural. They knew it, and it terrified them. They loved each other still, but an involuntary hatred had begun to filter venomously into that love, corrupting and embittering it as a poison corrupts as well. It was with these sentiments, and with the indifference of people to whom life has nothing left to offer, that they established themselves in their refuge, the abandoned Château de Hollande, which they had reached without notifying anyone, and where they wished to remain unknown. Unassisted, Agatha made the old castle almost habitable for them. Rejuvenated by the enchanted oxygen of her natal land, she sufficed unto herself, and spared them the slightest trouble. The shutters she left tightly closed, but to air the musty halls and chambers she opened the windows behind them. She dusted and she rubbed the furniture, which cracked with the weight of age. From the closets she took and piled the yellow linen. She made the beds and heated them, delivering them from that sepulchral impression which old linen has lain long uninhaled expires. In spite of the 3 people who had come there, exteriorly the castle was unchanged. To the peasants who passed it, who paid no more attention to it than if it had never existed, it was empty still. They had always seen it there, with its barred shutters. They were familiar. The excommunicated appearance which it possessed had ceased to impress them, and when they passed that way they gave no heed to the singularity of a castle inhabited by a silence that resembled death. The tenant farmers of Hollande lived too far from the castle to be aware of what was happening there. Agatha was 40 years old when she disappeared with her mistress, and the 20 years of her absence had changed her appearance so completely that there was no one in the marketplace to recognize her. To the peasants, she was merely an old woman of their own class, who paid cash and held her tongue. The Normans are taciturn, and so distrustful that they make no advances until advances are made to them. They attend to their own business, and not to the affairs of others. As a consequence, Agatha was not embarrassed by any inquisitive curiosity. The roads that led to the castle were rarely used, for the castle itself was beyond the highways that led to the villages of Deneville and Saint-Germain-sur-Aille. The entrance to it was a great rusted gate provided with an interior shutter that cut off any view of the court, but beyond the castle, in an angle of the garden wall, was a little low door, and it was that which Agatha used when she went to the market. On returning, before putting the key in the lock, she looked around carefully, like a thief. Her precautions were needless. There was never anyone about. In accordance with her intention, Madame de Fragile created there a greater solitude than the one she had left, one that was not solitude alone, but captivity as well, but against which Lasthany made no effort to revolt. The idea of honor, as the world accepts it, occupied much less space in her virginal and weakened mind than it had in her mother, but always she had been obedient, and now she was too wholly demoralized to complain. Agatha, in her fanatic love for the young girl, whom she had never suspected of a purity that was not immaculate, was not at all surprised at this mysterious and prodigious isolation. It seemed very natural that Madame de Fragile should be unwilling to let anyone see what a ruin Lasthany was, or to have anyone say, "That is what the noble demoiselle de Hollande has brought back from her scandalous elopement." Meanwhile, she buried herself with the plan of a pilgrimage to the tomb of the blissful Thomas de Belleville, and of the exorcism which was to follow. If her prayers were unanswered, Madame de Fragile was therefore unhindered by her daughter or by Agatha, without whose aid indeed she could not have created the cloister that she had. Her Hollande was a cloister, but without chapel or services, a thing which added to Madame de Fragile's remorse. Even veiled, she could not have gone to mass in the neighborhood parish, for at that time it was dangerous to leave Lasthany alone for a minute. "I must sacrifice to her," she resentfully reflected, "even the duties of religion, duties that were weightier to that Jansenist than to anyone. She damns us both." This intensity in religion it is necessary to understand in order to appreciate what the woman suffered, for she did suffer, and acutely. The castle which I have compared to a nunless and chapelless cloister soon became to Lasthany and herself as suffocating as the post-chaise, which had affected them like a coffin. Happily, if such a word can be used in a story like this, happily about the castle there was space enough to breathe in. The walls of the uncultivated garden were sufficiently high to conceal the 2 recluses when they cared to take a few steps in the open air. Soon, however, Lasthany left the garden to itself. She preferred to lie on the lounge, which her mother occupied at night. For, like a jailer, worse even than in prison, for the jailer is not always present, Madame de Fragile never left her side. Lasthany lived with hers, a jailer tenaciously silent now, but omnipresent and implacable. Madame de Fragile had adopted an attitude which gives some idea of the strength of her character. She said nothing to Lasthany. She no longer reproached her. She understood at last the impossibility of conquering a girl who was at once so weak and so firm, and that firmness was an example to her. The silence which between them had always more or less existed at this time became absolute. It was the silence of 2 corpses in the same bier, of 2 corpses that were not dead, who, within the 4 dumb planks of a coffin, saw and touched each other. The funereal silence was the most insupportable of all things they underwent. Prayer is not, as St. Martin had said, the breath of the soul. The soul's breath is untrammeled speech, the full expression of a thought, whether of love or of hate, of prayer or of blasphemy, of cursing or benediction. Whoso is condemned to silence is condemned to be suffocated and yet not die. It was to that which these women in their despair had condemned themselves. To each, the silence of the other was death. Madame de Frejol, whose face was nothing could alter, still spoke to God. She threw herself on her knees before her daughter, and prayed to him in imploring undertones. But Lasthany addressed God as seldom as she addressed her mother, and smiled even, an evil smile, one that was vaguely scornful, at the sight of her mother kneeling in prayer at her side. The injustice her mother had taken from her all belief in the justice of God. Agatha, whom Madame de Frejol kept at arm's length, did not dare to come with her work into that room where no one spoke. And, although beside herself with anxiety because of Lasthany, she was glad nevertheless to resume possession of the places and things she knew so well, and she busied herself with the household duties which her mistress seemed to have entirely forgotten. Without Agatha, who fed them as infants and lunatics are fed, they would have perhaps both died of hunger, absorbed in devouring thoughts.